Hello, and welcome back to the Tik-A Tee Method for week 27. My name is Ron Castingway. For the last 3 videos for week 24, week 25, and week 26, I talked all about triplets in a simple time signature, that 3-to-1 ratio and that 3-to-2 ratio. We talked about borrowed division from a compound time signature to a simple time signature. And in last week's video, week 26, I introduced a new vocabulary word, tuplets, which refers to any grouping of notes that does not normally occur in a given time signature, most often referring to borrowed division. Well, for today's video, I'm flipping the script. What if we borrow subdivisions from a simple time signature to a compound time signature? Makes for a lot of fun rhythmic opportunities. So I hope you're going to stick around for the whole video, do some exercises with me, because we're going to learn all about it right now. Okay, here we are on the first page of week 27, and as you can plainly see, we are taking tuplets to the next level. Let's recap that definition though one more time just to be safe. Tuplets refers to a grouping of notes that does not normally occur in a given time signature, most often and usually referring to a borrowed division. This means that the term tuplets is a general term that refers to those borrowed divisions or those groupings of notes that can occur in both simple time signatures as well as compound time signatures. When we label groupings of notes as triplets, duplets, quadruplets, quintuplets, these are specific labels or types of tuplets. I hope that makes sense. And as you can see from the diagram and the examples below, we're talking about borrowed divisions from a simple time signature to a compound time signature. For week 27, I'm going to focus on 6/8 as our time signature, and we're going to hone in on 2 different simple time signature subdivisions, the duplet and the quadruplet. Let's start with the duplet. We know that in 6/8, the dotted quarter notes getting the beat, each one of those dotted quarter notes is divided into 3 equal eighth notes. It sounds like this. T, 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 so forth and so on. The subdivision of each of those beats being divided equally into 3 eighth notes is the normal or the typical subdivision of the beat or the pulse in 6/8. So when I refer to a tuplet as a grouping of notes that does not normally occur in a given time signature, let's talk about that duplet. Duplets, shown here in the center of the page, are notated as 2 beamed eighth notes with a 2 and a bracket above the note heads. And as you probably guessed it, since we're borrowing from a simple time signature, these are going to sound exactly like 2 eighth notes would sound in a given beat in common time, for example. The difference is that we're borrowing from simple to compound because we're actually going to be in 6/8 for the exercises in week 27, for example. That's why we have to notate it differently. Not only do we have to notate duplets differently, but we have to adapt the Tik-A Tee method verbiage differently as well. These are not going to be notated as eighth notes, so we're not going to say TT for these duplets. Now, when I was thinking about the Tik-A Tee verbiage for duplets, the D of duplets was not percussive enough, so I changed it to a T, and I'm just using the general term tuplets to designate duplets. So whenever we see duplets in a compound time signature in the Tik-A Tee method verbiage, we're going to say tuplet. Before I get into the math of duplets explained at the bottom of this diagram, let me demonstrate for you duplets. What I'm going to do is perform 4 measures in 6/8. Measures 1 and 3 will be the normal or the typical subdivision of each of those dotted quarter notes into 3 equal eighth notes. Measures 2 and 4 will be filled with duplets, which again in the Tik-A Tee verbiage is pronounced as tuplet. Okay? I'm going to give myself a 2-measure count off. Here it is. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 tuplet, tuplet, T, 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 tuplet, tuplet. So I hope that helps. And even though I performed those duplets really staccato in an effort to emphasize that subdivision of 2, you can probably hear that they sound just like 2 eighth notes would sound in a simple time signature. But we're not going to say TT here because they are not notated as 2 eighth notes, they're notated as duplets. So the Tik-A Tee verbiage has to translate accordingly. Moving to the math of duplets towards the bottom of this diagram, this actually shows another way that duplets could be notated in 6/8, for example, as 2 dotted eighth notes beamed together. That is the equivalent to that 2:3 ratio of duplets. Why does that work out? Let me show you the math by looking at this right-hand example here. We can see that a dotted eighth note is broken down into 3/16 notes. Okay, so we're breaking this beat exactly in half here by taking 3/16 notes and combining them into a dotted eighth note. By breaking the beat exactly in half, we now have a ratio of 2:3, which is equivalent to duplets. So it could be notated this way. Now, if you ask me which way is more common, how would you see it in music notation? It really could go either way. I've actually seen it notated more frequently as duplets, as this one here on the left-hand side, than I have as 2 dotted eighth notes. And let's finish off this page here by looking at this example, this renotation example at the bottom of the page. We know that 6/8 is 2 beats in the measure, and the dotted quarter note gets the beat. Well, we also know that 2/4 is 2 beats in the measure. The only difference is the quarter note's getting the beat. So what I've done here at the bottom is I've just renotated the same rhythm and using borrowed divisions, one going from simple to compound and one going from compound to simple. These are identical rhythms renotated in 2 different time signatures, but both time signatures have 2 beats in each measure. Okay, so let me demonstrate here. I'll perform the 2/4 measure and go directly into the 6/8 measure using the appropriate Tik-A Tee verbiage. Here it is. 1, 2, ready, and triplet, T, 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 tuplet. Let me do that one more time. 1, 2, ready, and triplet, T, 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 tuplet. So you can hear that they're the same exact rhythm. It just depends on where we're borrowing from. All right, while we have duplets fresh in our mind here, and before I introduce quadruplets, let's go find a practice exercise that only has duplets in it. All right, here we are at exercise 27A. This exercise only has duplets included in it, and it also has the Tik-A Tee verbiage, which is really helpful. Let's get to the analysis. In the first measure, we have TTT, the normal, the typical subdivision in 6/8, followed immediately by a tuplet, a duplet in this case, borrowed division. Our invisible bar line will go right here. This will be beat 2, divided now into 2 instead of 3. Okay, measure 2, we've got a dotted quarter note, invisible bar line, and more duplets, again pronounced in the Tik-A Tee verbiage as tuplet. Measure 3, we have a duplet, invisible bar line, the typical subdivision in 6/8, 3/8 notes, and then we finish off in measure 4 with a dotted quarter note on beat 1, and awesome, we've got a dotted quarter rest on beat 2, and you know what we need to be doing, looking ahead to that next measure. In measure 5, we've got a quarter note going to an eighth note, a very common rhythm in 6/8. Your invisible bar line will go right here. Then on beat 2, we've got TTT, the normal or typical subdivision in 6/8. Measure 6, we've got a duplet on beat 1 and on beat 2 with that invisible bar line going right down the middle. Measure 7, TTT, invisible bar line, and then ta held over into that last measure. So in measure 8, I'm going to parenthesize beat 1 because we will not re-articulate that eighth note. We will then say the remaining 2 eighth notes after beat 1, invisible bar line, dotted quarter note here on beat 2, and definitely write -1 there, as I would tell my students, so they hold that dotted quarter note out full value. Okay, 27A is a very straightforward example of going between that subdivision of 3, the normal or typical subdivision in 6/8, to 2 with all of those duplets included. So let's throw a metronome on, let's get a pitch, and let's perform this exercise together. Okay, the first thing I want to do is clear the ink from the page. I know we just analyzed it, we put in all those beats, but this is a pretty straightforward exercise, and it includes the Tik-A Tee verbiage, which is very helpful. You'll notice that I changed my metronome this week. This one comes to us from violinspiration.com. Cool name for a website. Thank you to the folks at that website for offering up a free online metronome, and as you can see, this one also has some really cool subdivision options. I'm going to be at 62 beats per minute for this exercise, which translates to the dotted quarter note equals 62. And I'll be singing this again on a G3 as I normally do. You can join me on that note an octave lower, an octave higher, or a different note altogether, but keep in mind the idea is that you actually perform these exercises with me. Okay, let's get the metronome started. There it is. Here's my G3. That's what I'll be singing it on. I'll give us a 2-measure count off. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 tuplet, ta, tuplet, tuplet, T, 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 ta, ta, T, 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 tuplet, tuplet, T, 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 ta, T, T, ta. All right, let's stop that metronome. Okay, so you could probably hear that some of these tuplets sound exactly like eighth notes do in 2/4. As a matter of fact, measure 6 could just be notated as a 2/4 measure with 4 eighth notes in it, right? But it's not. It's notated as duplets and 6/8. That's why we pronounce it as tuplets. Okay, we need to know, did we make any mistakes? Did we get it all right? We have to go to my website and find the MP3 for exercise 27A to check our work. Let's go. All right, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3s that accompany my book. We're all queued up and ready to go here for exercise 27A, but let's first review your options when you go to my website and you find these MP3s once you've performed an exercise. Option number 1 is to check your work by just listening to the MP3. Option number 2 is to actually vocalize or perform along with that MP3 with your voice. And option number 3, especially if your primary instrument is not the voice, break out your instrument and perform the exercise along with the MP3. Okay, so make your decision, option 1, 2, or 3, because without further ado, I'm pressing play on exercise 27A. One, 2, ready, and T, 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 tuplet, ta, tuplet, tuplet, T, 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 ta, ta, T, 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 tuplet, tuplet, T, 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 ta, T, T, ta. All right, there you have it, exercise 27A. And you'll notice here in the MP3 recording of this exercise, the tuplets are more legato. They're more held out full value. When I performed this exercise just a moment ago, I had the tuplets or the duplets a little more staccato to really emphasize that breakdown of the beat into 2 equal parts. But it's more appropriately or more accurately performed here on the MP3. Everything should be legato or full value unless otherwise notated. Okay, you know the drill. If you did not yet choose option 3, which means that you need to perform it on your instrument, this exercise, you need to do that now before moving on to the next exercise. One, 2, ready, and Okay, let's introduce quadruplets before our next exercise. We know that duplets was a 2-to-3 ratio, meaning that we are now taking 2/8 notes and putting them where 3 normally existed. Well, here for quadruplets, we're going to have 4/8 notes where 3 normally existed. So we're going the opposite direction. Instead of having fewer notes within the beat, we're actually going to have more notes within the beat. And again, this is a borrowed division from a simple time signature over to a compound time signature. You can think of quadruplets in 6/8, for example, as 16th notes because they're going to sound the same. However, we are not going to pronounce quadruplets as Tik-A Tik-A. Because number one, they're not 16th notes. We have 16th notes in 6/8. There are 6 of them for each beat. Tik-A, 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 so forth and so on. These are quadruplets. So we're going to say quadruplets as our Tik-A Tee verbiage for this grouping or borrowed division. Or more properly referred to as a tuplet, because yes, a quadruplet falls under the category of being a tuplet. Quadruplet is just a specific label or a specific type of tuplet. And before I get to the math of quadruplets, let me demonstrate what they sound like. What I'll do is a full measure of eighth notes with the typical breakdown, the normal breakdown of that dotted quarter note into 3 equal eighth notes. Then I'll do a measure of quadruplets, 2 full beats of quadruplets. And you'll hear how they sound like 16th notes, but with the Tik-A Tee verbiage, it's quadruplet. All right? I'll give myself a 2-measure count off. Here it is. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 quadruplet, quadruplet. Let me do that again. It's really fun. Ready, and T, 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 quadruplet, quadruplet. In my opinion, that's actually more fun to say than Tik-A Tik-A. But anyway, that's what they sound like when applied to a 6/8 measure. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the math of quadruplets, but they could be notated another way in 6/8, for example. Check out this center example right here. 4 dotted 16th notes is equivalent to that 4-to-3 ratio of quadruplets. How does that work out mathematically? Well, if you look at this example to the right-hand side, that's 1 beat in 6/8. Each one of those dotted 16th notes can be broken down into 3 32nd notes. So that 1 beat in 6/8 is broken down into 4 equal parts. Let me show you. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's your 4-to-3 ratio. That's the math behind it. Now, what would you see in music notation? Would you actually come across a 6/8 measure with a beat of 4 dotted 16th notes beamed together? Possibly. It's actually possible, but I would venture to guess that most of the time, if you're in 6/8 and they want quadruplets or that quadruplet sound, it will be notated like this one here on the left as quadruplets. All right, I don't know about you, but I'm excited to go find an exercise that has duplets and quadruplets. Let's go find one. All right, I found one here. Exercise 27D has both duplets and quadruplets. Let's get to the analysis. Beat 1 is a typical breakdown in 6/8. T, 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 right? Those 3/8 notes breaking down that single dotted quarter note. Our invisible bar line is going to go right here. Then we have quadruplets on beat 2. Yes, they will sound like 16th notes. It's a 4-to-3 ratio, but we're going to say quadruplet on beat 2, breaking up that beat into 4 equal parts. Measure 2, we've got a duplet. Tuplet is the verbiage for Tik-A Tee. Here's our invisible bar line. Beat 2 is this dotted quarter note. Measure 3, beat 1, T, 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 tied over into beat 2, which I'll parenthesize since we're not going to re-articulate that 8th note. Then we have 2 8th notes to finish off beat 2. Beat 1 is a dotted quarter note here in measure 4, and another dotted quarter note on beat 2 in measure 4, giving us that opportunity to look ahead to that next line. But before I get to that next measure, I forgot an invisible bar line in measure 3, so let's throw that in first. We've got it happening right underneath that tie. Okay, let's go to measure 5 now. We've got a duplet here on beat 1, followed by an invisible bar line. Now, on beat 2, we have another duplet, but it's an 8th rest to start it off. So, in the verbiage, we're not going to say tup. we're only going to say let, but it will be that same breakdown into 2 equal parts, but the first part's going to be a rest. That should be fun. Measure 6, T, 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 invisible bar line. Beat 2 of measure 6 is this duplet right here, again pronounced as tuplet. In measure 7, we have ta. Invisible bar line goes right here, tied over into beat 2, so I'll parenthesize that since we're not going to re-articulate that 8th note. Then we finish off beat 2 with those 2 8th notes, closing off measure 8 here with a dotted quarter note held out all the way to beat 2 to that dotted quarter rest, and that closes off the exercise. Okay, so this exercise has a little bit of everything. We've got some duplets, we've got some quadruplets, we've got some 8th notes, we've got some ties, we even have a rest incorporated into one of our duplets. Let's get a metronome going, let's find a pitch, and let's perform this one. Okay, let's clear the ink again for this exercise. I know we just analyzed it, but the Tik-A Tee verbiage is included again, so hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to stay at 62 beats per minute, or in our case here for 6/8, the dotted quarter note equals 62. Let's get the metronome started. There we go. I'm going to sing this on a G3. And I'm going to give us a 2-measure count off. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 quadruplet, tuplet, ta, T, 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 ta, ta, tuplet, let, T, 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 tuplet, ta, T, T, ta. All right, there it is. Let's stop the metronome. Okay, you could probably hear those quadruplets sounding like 16th notes. That's a really fun thing to say. All right, we need to know if we did this right. How do we find out? We go to my website, we find the MP3 for exercise 27D and check that way. Let's go find that MP3 right now. All right, here we are back at my website. I've got exercise 27D all queued up. You know what your 3 options are, so choose one right now because I'm not going to waste any time. I'm pressing play. Here we go. One, 2, ready, and T, 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 quadruplet, tuplet, ta, T, 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 ta, ta, tuplet, let, T, 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 tuplet, ta, T, T, ta. All right, there it is, exercise 27D. Again, performed much more legato than perhaps I performed it. And you can hear how in the metronome that I created within Logic, that you're not only getting those dotted quarter notes, you're getting the subdivision of that dotted quarter note with those 3 8th notes. So when you have the quadruplets and the duplets, you can sort of hear that they have this syncopation feel in 6/8. They're really, really fun, really cool. Okay, if you did not yet perform exercise 27D, you need to do that on your instrument before you can go to that next exercise. So break out that instrument. Let's make it happen. One, 2, ready, and all right, that does it for week 27. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had as much fun as I did performing those duplets and those quadruplets. Stay tuned for week 28 when I introduce more compound time signatures. We know that when the top number is a 6, a 9, or a 12, more often than not, it's going to be a compound time signature. Well, what if the bottom number is a 2, or a 4, or even a 16? We're going to talk about it in week week 28. That's going to be a really fun video. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, help out the channel. Hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get the latest video. And please, if you're inspired to do so, leave a comment, leave a question. I will reply to any and all comments. And don't forget to go out and get my book. It's available at my website, roncastingway.com. It's also available on Amazon and at jwpepper.com. So until next time, thank you again for allowing me to be part of your rhythmic journey. I will see you in week 28.